Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education at Brandeis University. I'm John Levison. I'm director of the Mandel Center. I'm delighted to welcome you to this ongoing series of conversations with scholars of Jewish education. And today's session and all of our events help us to serve the mission of the Mandel Center by supporting scholarship and getting important ideas out into the world. We encourage you to take a look at the Mandel Center events page to learn about our upcoming events, other upcoming events. And we're delighted to have so many of you joining us live. We're always happy to see you. We hope to be able to take some of your questions as we go. So please feel free to post those questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We are also recording today's session as we record all of our sessions. We'll make the recording available afterwards, both via our website and via our podcast. So I encourage you to keep an eye out for that, and you should, sign up for all those things to stay in the loop. Our guest today is my friend and colleague, Hannah Kober. Hannah is completing her doctorate now at Stanford University, where she's been a Jim Joseph Fellow. She's been a Wexner Graduate Fellow. She's also a participant in the Doctoral Fellows program here at the Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education. And she's also a David Hartman Center Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. And last but not least, I'm also proud that she is an alumna of Brandeis University. And we invited Hannah to participate in this series so that we could talk about her recently published article in the Journal of Jewish Education. The title of the article is A Fraying Connection: Israeli-American Perspectives on Diasporic Hebrew Learning Through and Beyond Jewish Education. I loved reading this article, and I'm really excited to talk about it with Hannah. So Hannah, welcome. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So in order to get the conversation rolling, I'd like to start as I always do with the backstory. So tell us how you decided that you wanted to study Hebrew language and why specifically among Israeli Americans. And then also tell us a little bit about your methodology. So what did your research process for this particular article look like?
Great. So back when I was studying at Brandeis for my BA, I was focusing on applied linguistics, sociology of language, sociolinguistics, and Jewish studies. And I was interested in thinking about how different Jewish communities use language, but I was very hesitant for a long time to think more deeply about the Hebrew learning environments that I had been in and that I was teaching in at the time. But as I went through, my teaching experiences and my thesis writing experience, I had been writing about Jewish Arabic learners in Israel. I realized that I had a lot to unpack about American Hebrew education. And it turns out as soon as I opened my mouth about that, I became a vessel for everyone's stories and baggage about Hebrew learning. And then I realized that my work was not done. And I started this PhD in educational linguistics at Stanford to unpack some of the dynamics that make Hebrew education the way it is in the United States, and thinking more specifically about how different stakeholders think about what they're doing when they're engaging in Hebrew learning or Hebrew teaching. And I ran with that for a bit, and I was hoping to do an in-class ethnography, thinking about how student-teacher dynamics play out when it comes to accent correction, and whether that changes the relationship that students have with the language in the long term. The pandemic hit, and I had to find a more pandemic-savvy project, and I found an ad on the internet for an initiative to push Hebrew into LA public high schools. And it was coming out of the Israeli expat population in LA. And I said, oh, this is interesting. I have always been thinking about the ways in which different users of Hebrew interact with each other in schools. But I didn't think so much about flipping the script, not thinking about American Jewish experience. And by American Jews, I mean people who don't have Israeli heritage, as opposed to American Jews who actually do have Israeli heritage, and thinking about their perspectives when they enter a classroom, when they seek Hebrew learning opportunities for their kids or for themselves, and thinking more deeply about how that demographic has evolved as a growing base of Hebrew learners in the United States. So that's how I landed on this particular project, and it has taken me, this was my pilot study for my dissertation. And this study took place in LA, but I was in the Bay Area for most of it. And I interviewed members of this initiative. I call them the IACE, the Israeli Americans for Civic Education. And it was part of this broader organization that was making the voice, or aiming to make the voice, of Israeli Americans in the greater LA area, but also nationally, louder, clearer for for the levers of power in civic institutions. And I thought to myself, this is interesting, the process of leaning on public institutions to give you private goods, to give you, your heritage language resources. And I asked these parents in a multi-series conversation, why this program? Why are we interested in Hebrew in public schools? Why now? Where? And how does that relate to the many, many options that exist in LA? What does that say about these parents as users or non-users of the institutions that are around them? And what are their actual needs in their own words? I ended up listening to their, it was a qualitative study only. I also did some observations at local programs and meetings with the school board. And I analyzed their interview transcripts, looking for how they identify their needs as compared to the needs of non-Israeli American Jews.
Right.
And I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but I used grounded theory methods and drew out a narrative about language loss on the one hand as one animating concern, and authenticity and concerns about preserving authenticity and recreating authenticity on American soil.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you started talking about accent. Maybe we'll circle back to questions of accent, because it turns out that accent becomes really significant in fascinating ways. So this is a population that is not typically studied. We haven't done a lot of work. We, meaning scholars, haven't done a lot of work with Israeli Americans, and you heard a great deal of interest and of concern, and you're trying to understand the nature of that concern, especially as it relates to Hebrew language, and then as it kind of ripples out into other areas. So what's the argument at the 30,000-foot level? What did you learn from these families about how they think about Hebrew?
Well, I learned that they're not a monolith,
Sure.
which I came in with that assumption, but their voices made that ever more clear, particularly around the experiences they've had with American Jewish institutions, and different points of access they have to Jewish life in an American context, and that those experiences and those assumptions about what's going on at schools, at Hebrew schools, at camps, and things like that informs their level of trust in the institution to give them the Hebrew language resources they're looking for their kids. So they're looking for cues from fellow Israeli families who are in the area. They're, have their kids' friends over for a play date, and whether the kid can or cannot communicate in Hebrew after a certain number of years in day school is a sign for them about, or their accent use is a sign for them about whether they would want their own kids in that environment. And there are key markers of authenticity that extend beyond just the linguistic pieces. So there are also concerns about religious coercion. So if there are fears that institutions will force them, or educators in institutions will force their kids to use blessings and use God language, and access texts in a way that they don't particularly appreciate, that are unfamiliar to them.
I just want
Also,
to clarify. So
yeah.
in that case, you're talking specifically about Israelis who self-identify as secular or Chiloni,
Yes,
and
yes,
that comes with sort of a set of assumptions about what they don't want
right.
in a context in which they're learning Hebrew, I, as a secular Israeli American, I want to make sure that my child is not subject to religious coercion.
Right. And also religious schooling more broadly is a strange concept for many of them.
Mhm.
But I thank you for making that clarification. And also I'll put in a plug. I'm writing a paper right now about really nuancing our understanding of what Israeli secularism means to these families, based on a project I did in the Bay Area. And secular can also entail a lot of different relationships
Right.
to organized religion. So we'll table that, but definitely there's a lot more there. And also the last piece there is about political commitments. So if a school wavers in their support for Israel and their public
Mhm.
messaging, that sends a message to these parents about whether the stuff they teach there, the content they teach there has the integrity that they're looking for.
Right.
Uh,
Right. And I guess we should clarify for our listeners that you carried out this research before October 7th, right? So these are we can hypothesize about how families or individuals will respond now, but this was in pre October 7th and before the war in Gaza and
this was deep COVID. This was 2020 and
yeah,
2021. So yeah, different set of circumstances at play.
right,
But
right.
the war in Gaza in 2021 was ongoing while I was doing my last interviews for this study.
The current war?
No, the previous
The
in
previous conflict.
2021.
Right. Got it. Um, Okay, so tell me more about this idea of authenticity. It's already come up briefly, and to a certain extent, authenticity is always present. Concerns about authenticity are always present whenever we make judgments about what kinds of Jewish practice we should emphasize or display, and it's particularly relevant to language. We make judgments about authentic use of language, about accents. But tell us what you found about how the issue of authenticity plays out for these particular Israeli American families.
So it really varies. And in this study, it's a small case. I really had parents who were along a pretty wide spectrum on this. So I had one parent who is also a Hebrew educator herself, who was very concerned that her children be taught when it came to formal Hebrew instruction, were taught by Israelis, native Hebrew speakers, and that the sort of like the full zeitgeist of Israeliness could be transmitted to her kid through somebody who really knew that themselves. Then you had somebody who's sort of, one step over in the other direction, saying, it would be nice, but actually it's just most important that I have reinforcement outside of the house
Mhm.
in Hebrew language, because it's really hard for me to get all of this across in the limited time that I have at home with my kids. I'm not going to teach them how to write on my own, right? And then sort of all the way on the other end of that spectrum, you have someone longtime educator. She was older. She's also a grandmother, and her granddaughter goes to a Jewish day school in the DC area. And she said to me during our first conversation, my granddaughter sounds like an American day school student, and I don't mind.
Hmm.
And we unpacked that for a bit. What does it mean to sound like an American day school student? A lot of it was accent, sort of the pace. But the thing is that this is somebody who technically has Israeli heritage, this young girl. But to her, the Israeliness was less important to her as long as her grandchild was connected to Jewish life.
Mhm.
So the accent didn't matter as much.
Mhm.
The sort of the particular relationships that they might have with institutions didn't matter as much.
Mhm.
The apprehension or the desire for Israeli-centered programming didn't matter as much. So that sort of, um,
So
you
there's
know,
that range.
yeah.
And so at one point in the article, you named a couple of assumptions that the phrase you use may have flattened inquiry, right? So you want to kind of call attention to these assumptions, and one of the assumptions um, is about the temporariness of the Israeli American community. Some assumption that, of course, Israeli Americans are only here on a temporary basis, which would have a lot of implications for language learning, among other things, because maybe you're learning language in order to then be comfortable when you return. I'm actually less interested in that. I'm interested in this other assumption about what you call the stability of Hebrew knowledge, an assumption about the stability of Hebrew knowledge. What did you mean by that?
So I have a story for that. I was at my synagogue in San Francisco when I was living there, and we were putting chairs away at the end of services. And I was telling someone in the community about my dissertation research because she asked me for the first time. And she said, you know what? I was the experimental generation. She's a woman in her early 40s, and she grew up in Palo Alto. And she said, my parents assumed that if they spoke to me in Hebrew at home and sent me to public school, without any other additional reinforcement or experiential education components, I would turn out a cookie cutter Israeli as if I were born,
Uh-huh.
as if I lived in Israel my whole life. And we know that that's not how that works in many cases, right? And the experimental generation piece was really key for me because when I started to do my research, I was capturing a major spurt in, and activities that are directed toward giving Hebrew language resources for Israelis who are in the United States for however long they're here. So that, I sometimes say when I'm being flipped that, language acquisition isn't magic, and kids don't just pop out speaking whatever language their parents speak, right? So there's a lot that needs to go on to enable that long-term acquisition.
Mhm.
And that's, I think, sort of the short answer to your question.
Great, great. Before I go on, I want to remind our listeners that they are welcome to add questions through the Q&A function. And I'll keep an eye out for that as we go and hopefully be able to integrate one or two questions. Sorry, go
I
ahead.
actually just have one last piece there,
Yeah.
which is that the assumption that kids who come from Hebrew-speaking homes will speak Hebrew as adults and also will feed into the pipeline of Hebrew educators has proven to be a very, very weak idea. Because if they are not if they don't feel like they're conversant or have that level of facility with Hebrew, they're not going to be drawn into that pipeline.
Mhm.
And there are a lot of pipeline that I'm sure several folks on this call could speak to at length pertaining to pipeline of Hebrew educators in this country. So I think that that's also something that we leave unchecked sometimes. I wanted to put on the table.
Right. So there's an assumption about the kind of the role that Israeli Americans play as Hebrew educators more broadly for the American Jewish community or even
Right.
beyond the American Jewish community. Um, but a lot of things have to happen in order for a particular person born or raised in the United States to actually feel like that's something that they can and they want to invest in.
Yeah.
And then that's a good segue to the next question because we have this category. It's an important category in second language acquisition of heritage language learners, right? There are some people who have a connection to a language through their family, and other people don't, right?
Mhm.
If I was to decide to learn Korean, I have no connection there, and I'm just coming in as an outsider, and it feels intuitive that that having that heritage should make a difference. But you're also pointing out how complicated those connections are. So tell us a little bit more about why heritage language learners as a category is actually maybe too broad or complicated.
Yeah, or possibly even too narrow. So when we talk about heritage language learners, we assume that you're a heritage language learner in one language.
Mm,
So I have in the study Rivital, who is actually, she's from the former Soviet Union. She moved to Israel as a teenager. Russian is technically her heritage language. Her husband is an American who isn't Jewish, who's a monolingual English speaker. So when we think about heritage learners in general, we think about the Jewish community more broadly. When we think about Israelis in the United States, we need to actually consider blended families in that way. So that's sort of one piece there. That assuming that it's a two-headed household, that both parents can reinforce it at home is a stretch in a lot of cases, right? Even though many of the people I've spoken to over the years have fit into that category. Um, and then I'll say about the about like outcomes of heritage language learners. And I'm going to sort of put that in a bucket. Like, we assume that heritage language learners will be more successful if they are, if they're hearing the language at home, if they are having opportunities to be immersed in terms of the public sphere, if they have travel to their home, to the homeland, things
Mhm.
like that, which during the pandemic, there were a lot of those dynamics were in flux. So I'm talking to parents who can't actually take their kids to
Right.
Israel. When I was doing this study, that's an important thing. But you end up also with a really, really wide range of, the efforts that families are willing to put into have external resources, Zoom classes, summer camp, Sofim, like Israeli Scouts, things like
Mhm.
that,
Mhm.
you know, create that immersive environment. And you also have kids with idiosyncratic personalities. So I'll bring an example from the study I'm working on right now. You have on the one end, in terms of, maximally plugged in parents who are working really hard to put their kids in Hebrew speaking environments. Their social circle is Hebrew speaking. And you have a kid who's, quite frankly, is quite gifted, taught himself how to read in Hebrew just from the books in his house. And he can tell you all about, the seating capacity of major stadiums all around the world in Hebrew. He did that in real life. And then you have, on the other hand, plenty of kids in between. On the other hand, you have a parent who wants to care, but quite frankly doesn't feel like she has the bandwidth to reinforce Hebrew at home.
Mhm.
She hasn't really done much in the way of outsourcing Hebrew instruction or Hebrew exposure outside of the home. And she has a kid who's really resistant to the idea of responding to her in Hebrew. And her older, this is the younger child, the first child showed signs of sort of flipping into English, and the younger kid took that cue
Uh-huh.
and is really, disinterested and makes that very, very clear. He's only 7 right now. So to give you a sense of, really what you can expect in that range, it's
Right.
quite wide. So
Right.
assuming that heritage learners perform in one way or engage in one way, or, is sort of a little bit of a futile exercise, but it's important to understand that they are getting some Hebrew at home. Their parents are by and large speaking to them in Hebrew, maybe not in public, but at home. And many American Jews do not have access to that kind of language atmosphere.
Right. Right. So there are inputs, whether
Mhm.
that's actual linguistic inputs or emotional inputs that affect their motivation, but we don't always know how that plays out. And families are
Mhm.
complicated, and
Right.
motivations are not always simple and straightforward.
Mhm.
Right. We can imagine, for some kids, the way they are going to resist or act out is actually to resist what they identify as their parents' language.
Right.
Um, Even though, quote, they're heritage language learners. So,
Yeah, I
so
will say that I wonder if in the post-October 7th moment, whether there is more interest from some of those kids who initially would have been resistant, but are seeing that, there's hostility towards their identity, and they're having actually a different reaction to this moment where they're saying, oh, I really want to communicate with my cousins right now. I
right.
really want to stand proud for, where my family comes
Mhm.
from, things like that. I'm sure there's also the opposite, but I
Yeah.
wanted to name that.
Right. It's an excellent question, and we are starting to see some empirical research on American Jews and others around this, but we'll have to wait to kind of
Yeah.
see more about that. So, for these Israeli American families that you spoke to, how would you say what Hebrew actually means to them? You've referred a little bit to the idea of losing facility, or linguistic attrition is the term that you use at one point in the paper.
Mhm.
Um, so what does it mean to kind of carry around this fear of linguistic attrition as part of what of your thinking about the language?
I would say, in short, it's family, it's home. Um, it's the most salient connection to Judaism for those who are identify as more secular.
Mhm.
Um, and loss of those pieces, or the threat of loss of those pieces, is deeply emotional. Especially if you feel as a parent that you cannot actually communicate to your kid in the language that is most true to you, that you feel like you can be most expressive in. And so it sort of is very primal
Mhm.
in that sense.
So you heard from these families an undercurrent of anxiety, of fear?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And uh, sort of coming to terms with a more permanent stay in the United States, resulting in a different kind of language acquisition than they might have anticipated. And that's something that is challenging for some of the people I've spoken to, and for others, they realized when they, decided they were no longer sitting on their suitcases and they were going to buy a house in Tarzana, that their kids were going to become American and that they were going to have to cope with some of those aspects of loss.
Yeah, it feels to me like that's really important for us to think about, and us now I'm thinking about as a kind of a policy level, that heritage language learners are also sometimes operating within the context of this fear and this loss, right? That's emotionally freighted. It's not just, isn't it great that I get to hear some Hebrew sometimes? There's a lot going on here, and I guess my counsel then would be to educators to really try and be sensitive to those emotional dynamics, which are pretty powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that sensitivity is really important, and also um, listening to where those sensitivities are evoked in educational institutions is an important project, I would say, especially in moments like these. And I think, I'll talk about this more, I think, in a bit, but after October 7th, there are more Israeli families who are showing up at various non-Israeli centered American Jewish institutions.
Mhm.
And the institutions aren't quite sure how to accommodate these families. And sometimes they assume that they know all the answers, that if their kids just enroll in the day school, they're going to feel safe and loved and affirmed and whatnot, and aren't necessarily thinking about the particular aspects of their identity that might not be answered for in a program that wasn't actually built for them.
Right,
Um,
right. So we don't have a lot of time left, but
mhm.
I want to ask you to drill down on that just a little bit more, that, education, specifically Jewish education, is not always perceived as the solution to the problem. Sometimes it's perceived as actually contributing to, quote, the problem. So tell us more about that.
I guess what I heard from some of these parents is a fear of American Judaism, a fear of really the stigmas that are heard in Israeli society about American Judaism, that it's inauthentic, that it's very loose, that families are loosely plugged in, that they are un unknowledgeable about Jewish tradition and language. And even if these families don't know more Jewishly, there's sometimes a level of condescension toward American Jews, right? So I think that it's important for, those of us who think about this and who are practitioners in these spaces to really lean into that a little bit and hear where those points of tension are. Because it's, in the same way as, the families who actually are less plugged into this institutional landscape, and they might not know what goes on in these schools, they might have what to learn about what maybe liberal Jewish practice or liberal Jewish schooling has to offer them.
Mhm.
And maybe their assumptions from Israel don't totally reflect the reality on the ground. And the same is true for the level of humility of people who administer these programs and who do research in these spaces, to think more critically about how these families, the barriers to entry to these institutions.
Great. Okay, so we're coming up on the end of our 30 minutes. It always goes extremely quickly, but I want to make sure that I ask you my last question. And that is, why does this research matter? Why does it matter for Jewish educators, Jewish leaders? Why should we care?
I think for the reason that I alluded to earlier, well, actually several times at this point,
Uh,
Israelis in the United States are a growing base of American Jews. And if you care about the well-being of American Jewish families or Jewish families more broadly, it requires a deeper look at what American Jews or Jews who happen to be in the United States for whatever reason that brings them here are looking for in order to enable their success where they are. So I think that and the political geopolitical moment that we're in heightens that for for various folks who are deciding whether they want the United States or North America or wherever they might be, whether they want that to be their long-term home. And sometimes they're thinking about, and we need to be aware of that, they're thinking about what things will actually enable them to be true to themselves in a long-term way in their new environment. And that's where their voices come into this conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hannah. It is great to talk with you about your work. I want to thank all of you for joining us. I encourage you to check out the Mandel Center events page to learn about upcoming events, subscribe to our YouTube page, our podcast. Quickly, our next event will be titled Why Young Jews Love Yiddish. So we're moving from Israeli Americans and Hebrew to American Jews and Yiddish. And that is with Sandra Fox on February 8th. Thank you again, Hannah. Thank you all for joining us. Take care.
Thank you.